We're live to Sydney now. The New South Wales Premier Chris Minns delivering the Daily Telegraph Future Sydney Bradfield Oration.
Material things and the beauty of spiritual things. Now that might sound a little bit highfalutin, and if Dr. Bradfield would forgive me, I think interpreting his words, what he meant was when he speaks about spiritual things, the message is that when we build the concrete bones of our city, when we lay down the railway lines, when we pave the roads, and when we design our laws for new housing and infrastructure, all of those decisions are there to serve a higher purpose, to make our city beautiful and livable and allow people to write their own story in the history of this great town. When it comes to housing, the reasons we make plans is to give order and establish rules, but its purpose is to give people a roof over their heads, in a place where they want to live, with the chance to spend quality time with people that they care about. In other words, if the soul of a city is the life of its people, then the planning system exists to nurture that soul. And if that's our goal, and it has to be, then the unavoidable truth for Sydney is that we're not meeting the moment. And our planning system in Australia's largest city, its only international city, its most expensive city, is not working. It's not working if you're trying to build something for yourself, or if you're looking to buy your first home, or if you're a young person waiting endlessly on a Saturday morning for a rental inspection somewhere in Sydney. Our system is not planning to help you live the good life. Last year I came to Bradfield and set out some principles for reforming the system, which led to one of the largest rezonings in the state's history, led and designed by the Minister for Planning, Paul Scully, who's here with us today. A decision which, around train stations and transport hubs alone, will give us an additional 170,000 new homes in New South Wales. It's worth noting that those changes led to a sustained campaign of opposition from some Liberal and independent mayors and some Labor mayors. It led to an attempt to reverse those changes in Parliament and the re-establishment in parts of Sydney of the NIMBY movement, which had remained dormant for a period of time because they felt that the fight to stop progress had already well and truly been won. But notwithstanding these major changes, and looking at the broken nature of the planning system, which was so graphically represented on the front page of the Telegraph this week, this year I'm here to say that we need to go further, and we will. Over the past 12 months, we've been putting our shoulder to the wheel, trying to shift our housing system in New South Wales towards a culture that says yes, yes to new projects. But again and again, the wheel gets snagged against stubborn problems. There are still too many delays, too many obstacles, making life too difficult to build housing in the state. I'll give you some statistics. In the 3 years from July 2021 to July 2024, the average council assessment time for medium density residential apartments grew by 50%. So in that period of time, things have gotten worse, not better. And I think it's important to say that the fault just doesn't lie with every council. Some councils are taking on average just 23 days to assess development applications. Some are taking 462 days. It's clear for at least some councils they believe that they're curators of a museum never to be changed, which gets us to the crux of the problem. There is a disconnect between the state's need to support new housing and our ability to make it happen through the current planning system. The state traditionally has built the train lines and the schools, laying down the vision of Bradfield, as well as the hospitals and other basic infrastructure for a growing city. And we've left the question of where people are going to live up to local councils. With few exceptions, decisions about residential development have largely been the domain of councils, clocking in at nearly 90% of approvals for Sydney. And I think it's clear to say that that's led to our current difficulties and our huge problems. It means that we can't build enough homes in certain well-connected parts of our city because councils in major parts of the city are just banning them, and where good proposals are stuck in the planning system for just too long. Consider this. While the population across Western Sydney has boomed in the last 50 years, the Woollahra LGA has experienced a 15% reduction in its population since the 1960s. So we've got one of the wealthiest local government areas in the country, one of the wealthiest in the world, nestled right next to Sydney's CBD, and on the other side, some of the most stunning locations on earth, and its population is declining. While in southwestern Sydney, we're adding an extra street to its western fringe every other week. Not only is this robbing people of the chance to live in places like Woollahra and those surrounding areas, but if they choose to, but it's an incredibly expensive way to grow a city. Watching the system up close for nearly 18 months, it's clear something's got to give. And when Paul and I took office in our respective portfolios and jobs of March last year, we were faced with an unwieldy, complicated mess of a planning system. Alongside inflation that peaked at almost 8% in late 2022, as interest rates were rising and financing and capital for many important projects, important housing projects, were drying up for a lot of firms. However, I think it's fair to say, in all honesty with this crowd today, that neither of us anticipated the reluctance of the system. Both of us believed that the TOD changes, the R2 and the R3 planning moves, the billions spent in social housing at the last budget would shift the needle and speed up approvals. As I said, neither of us anticipated the reluctance of the system to move quickly and allow the remaining capital that was willing to invest in New South Wales to build new housing to flow. Paul told me unambiguously that we couldn't afford to wait any longer and that the changes that we had already announced needed to go further because we couldn't wait for them to bear fruit. We had to go further today. So today I'm announcing that Labor will make further changes to our planning system to give the state a significant and legitimate say in our housing future. We will create a state-led approval pathway for large new residential housing developments in New South Wales. In addition to that change, we will allow this new pathway to assess and approve spot rezonings at exactly the same time. Both assessments will be done by the state and in the process bypass local councils, potentially cutting years off the approval process for much-needed housing in New South Wales. Broadly, the policy development follows a simple principle. We need to allow new housing in parts of Sydney and regional New South Wales where housing is currently most feasible. The pathway will not be and cannot be for every single application above the threshold. But if the New South Wales Government receives an application that delivers on the state's housing priorities, then this process will allow for spot rezoning to get on and build those homes. And I need to say this, even if the application would not have been allowed by the existing local council's planning controls. At the same time, the government will create a new housing delivery authority to head this process. The authority will work with government and industry to establish the criteria for projects that will be part of the new pathway. But I want to assure you it will be a simple set of directions. Essentially, what does New South Wales need for new housing and where does it need to be built? This new process will be open and transparent. Developments that are consistent with the state's priorities will be given access to the new pathway, and it will begin in early 2025. The Housing Delivery Authority will ask for expressions of interest for projects above $60 million in Sydney and $30 million elsewhere in New South Wales. That equates to around 100 dwellings in Sydney and 40 dwellings everywhere else. In order to meet very strict probity guidelines and standards, these EOIs will be run by 3 very senior public servants in the state. Now, I acknowledge this is a big step forward and a significant change from the status quo. Because of this reform, the state will be assuming a larger say over the direction of major housing projects within New South Wales. And like any big change, I'm sure some people will push back against it. But we're making this call because we don't have any time to waste. Housing is the defining challenge of this age, a problem that breeds other problems. And if you look at the statistics of young people leaving New South Wales and Sydney in particular, it is very, very troubling. We're losing twice as many young people as we're gaining, at the same time as New South Wales is the drop-off point the largest proportion of inbound migration of any state in Australia at 37%. If there are unreasonable barriers out there to new housing, we need to pull them down. I'll finish where I started with a quote from Bradfield's PhD thesis, which still manages to ring true 100 years later. When approaching the problems of a growing city, he said, "The past history of the city must be known, present-day conditions understood, and the future visualised with imagination, originality, and sound practical judgment." As Dr. Bradfield understood, no single problem is beyond us. If we approach the future with the same sense of imagination and practical judgment, we can solve the problems plaguing the city. We can help people live the good life here in the greatest city on earth. Thank you so much.